Standing alone in that freezing courtroom, I felt like a criminal with nowhere left to run. My greedy Uncle Richard sat just 10 feet away, smirking beside his high-priced attorney, who had a mountain of forged papers ready to steal my late father's house. I couldn't afford a lawyer. I was 28, entirely broke, and on the verge of losing the only piece of my father I had left. The bailiff called our case, and the room went dead quiet. Then, Judge Evelyn Carter adjusted her glasses, leaned forward over the bench, and stared directly into my eyes. She didn't look at Richard, and she didn't look at his smug lawyer. Her voice broke the silence, deep and steady. "You don't remember me, do you?" My heart stopped. I had no idea who she was, until she pulled out an old, faded photograph. What happened next changed everything. My name is Claire Morgan. I am 28 years old, and until 3 months ago, I believed that honor and doing what was right would always be enough. I served 4 years in the military, learned how to endure sleepless nights, harsh conditions, and difficult missions, but nothing in my training prepared me for the quiet malice of my own family. After my honorable discharge, I came back home to Sacramento to take care of my father, Daniel Morgan. He was my entire world, a hard-working, honest mechanic who raised me alone after my mother passed away. When he died suddenly from a massive heart attack, the world beneath my feet simply caved in. Before his burial flowers had even withered, my Uncle Richard stepped into our lives like a vulture circling fresh prey. Now, here I was, standing in Department 4 of the county courthouse, clutching a worn manila folder with trembling fingers. Across the aisle sat Richard, looking immaculate in a charcoal suit, accompanied by his high-powered real estate attorney, Roger Sterling. They whispered to each other, occasionally glancing back at me with smirks that said everything without uttering a single word. "You don't belong here, and you are going to lose." I couldn't afford legal representation. Every dollar of my father's savings had gone toward his funeral expenses and medical bills. The courtroom was freezing, the air heavy with the sharp smell of polished mahogany and old paper. I felt entirely alone, staring down the barrel of an impossible fight to save my childhood home. The nightmare had begun just 4 days after my father's burial. I was still sitting in the living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes of condolence cards and the faint scent of his old leather jacket, when Richard arrived unannounced. He didn't come to comfort me or ask how I was coping. He came with an envelope clutched in his hand and a cold, calculating look in his eyes. He sat across from me at our worn kitchen table and laid out a set of crumpled handwritten documents. According to him, my father had signed over the deed of our 2-story craftsman house 2 years prior in exchange for $40,000 in cash to settle old debts. Richard claimed my father was practically living on borrowed time and borrowed money, and that the house had legally belonged to him all along. I knew my father. He was meticulous, proud, and never took a dime he couldn't pay back within a week. The idea that he had secretly sold our home behind my back was unthinkable. When I refused to pack my bags and hand over the keys, Richard's mask slipped. The gentle uncle vanished, replaced by a ruthless predator. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He told me that if I made this difficult, he would drag my name through the legal system, ruin my credit, and force me out onto the sidewalk in handcuffs. He gave me a simple choice: walk away quietly with nothing, or fight him and end up broke, humiliated and homeless. I chose to fight. "Case number 408, Morgan versus Morgan," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing off the courtroom walls. I stood up straight, pulling my shoulders back just like I used to in uniform, but inside my stomach was churning. Richard's lawyer, Roger Sterling, buttoned his tailored jacket and walked up to the podium with an effortless, predatory stride. He didn't even glance in my direction. To him, an unrepresented, grieving 28-year-old woman was little more than a mild inconvenience on his morning schedule. "Your Honor," Sterling began smoothly, his tone rich with polished authority. "We are here on a straightforward petition to quiet title and enforce an expedited eviction order. My client, Richard Morgan, holds a valid, executed agreement transferring full ownership of the residential property on Oak Ridge Drive. The defendant, despite repeated formal notices, refuses to vacate the premises and is currently trespassing on real estate that does not belong to her. Sterling stepped forward, placing a thick stack of documents before the clerk with theatrical confidence. He highlighted supposed payment ledgers, an affidavit from a supposed witness named Margaret Lewis, and signatures meant to prove that my father had surrendered all rights to our family home. Behind me, Richard leaned back in his leather chair, crossing one leg over the other. His lips curved into a smug, triumphant grin. He was utterly convinced the hearing was already decided, banking on the fact that without an attorney by my side, no one would bother questioning the legitimacy of his paper trail. He thought he had calculated every single detail, expecting the judge to simply stamp the eviction order and throw me out onto the street. Judge Evelyn Carter leaned over the high wooden bench, her sharp gaze scanning the eviction motion. She flipped through the pages slowly, the rustle of paper cutting through the tense silence of the room. Sterling stood poised, resting his hand on his leather briefcase with the calm assurance of a man awaiting an easy victory. Then, Judge Carter stopped. Her hand hovered over the file. She looked at the defendant's information line by line. Claire Morgan, daughter of Daniel Morgan, late of Sacramento County. She pushed her reading glasses down the bridge of her nose and stared straight past the attorneys, fixing her dark brown eyes entirely on me. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted instantly. Richard's confident smirk flickered. "Ms. Morgan," Judge Carter spoke, her voice carrying a quiet, resonant authority that silenced every breath in the gallery. "Please step forward to the podium." My legs felt heavy, but I walked up, gripping the edge of the wood to keep my hands from shaking. "Yes, Your Honor." She didn't look at the legal brief. She simply studied my face, as if searching through decades of memory. "You don't remember me, do you?" The question hung in the air like a sudden drop in pressure. Sterling blinked in surprise, turning to look between the judge and me. Richard sat up straight, his relaxed posture instantly vanishing. I'm sorry, Your Honor, I don't believe we've ever met," I stammered, my heart racing against my ribs. Judge Carter let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh. 12 years ago, Route 50 near Tahoe during that catastrophic November blizzard, an overturned sedan sinking into the shoulder ditch, and a brave mechanic with a frightened 16-year-old girl in the passenger seat of his tow truck. My mother and I were inside that car, freezing to death. A rush of heat flooded my chest as memories from a freezing night 12 years ago suddenly rushed back into sharp focus. I remembered the blinding snow, the flashing amber beacon of my dad's old flatbed truck, and how he had pulled over without a second thought to hook chains around an overturned smoking vehicle while emergency services were still miles away. Judge Carter opened a side drawer in her bench. With deliberate calm, she retrieved a small, worn leather-bound notebook and slipped an old Polaroid photograph from between the pages. She held it facing toward the bench, looking down at it with profound reverence before looking back up at me. "Every tow company had shut down due to the black ice," Judge Carter said, her words dropping like heavy stones across the silent courtroom. My mother had a broken collarbone, and hypothermia was setting in rapidly. A man named Daniel Morgan stopped. He spent 45 minutes out in sub-zero winds cutting through jammed door frames with hand tools, pulling us out just moments before the electrical fire engulfed the cabin. He loaded us into his warm truck, wrapped us in heavy blankets, and drove us directly to the emergency clinic. She paused, the emotion in the room thick enough to choke on. When I tried to offer him every dollar in my wallet, along with my mother's jewelry, your father shook his head and said, "Save your money and take care of your family. Kindness isn't for sale." Before he left, he handed my mother this picture of his daughter in her high school track uniform, proudly telling us you were going to do great things. Judge Carter set the photograph down. "I never forgot that face, Ms. Morgan, and I never forgot that man's integrity." Sterling cleared his throat aggressively, stepping forward to reassert control. "Your Honor, while that is an admirable sentiment, It has no legal bearing on the executed conveyance before you today. The contract is unambiguous, signed and witnessed by Margaret Lewis. Personal history cannot override binding California property statutes. Judge Carter's expression hardened into polished granite. You are entirely correct, counsel. The law governs this courtroom, and we will follow it to the exact letter. She picked up Sterling's thick filing, turning pages with meticulous precision. Let us examine your client's evidence under the strictest judicial scrutiny, starting with this purported deed, transfer dated March 14th of 2 years ago. She tapped a red pen against the signature line. The notary stamp belongs to Thomas Bell, whose official commission was formally revoked by the Secretary of State 4 months prior to this date. Furthermore, the property description references a municipal tax parcel reclassification that did not take legal effect until 6 months after this document was allegedly drafted and executed. The color rapidly drained from Sterling's face. Behind him, Richard gripped his chair, his knuckles turning stark white as his arrogant smirk completely shattered. This is not merely a flawed contract, counsel, Judge Carter said, her voice dropping into a chilling register. This is an overt, amateurish fabrication presented in bad faith to defraud a grieving heir. Did you genuinely believe an unrepresented defendant would lack the resources to expose such brazen perjury, and that this bench would simply rubber-stamp grand theft? She slammed the gavel down with a sharp crack that made both men flinch. I am referring this entire file, along with the false statements from Thomas Bell and Margaret Lewis, to the district attorney's office for an immediate criminal fraud investigation. The petition for eviction is hereby dismissed with prejudice, Judge Carter declared, her voice firm and resolute. Clear title to the property on Oak Ridge Drive remains solely and unquestionably with Claire Morgan. Mr. Sterling, you will face an immediate inquiry before the State Bar Ethics Committee, and Mr. Richard Morgan, you are remanded into custody pending formal felony indictment. 2 bailiffs stepped behind Richard, clicking heavy handcuffs around his wrists. The man who had walked in expecting to strip me of everything was led away pale, trembling, and utterly broken. As the gallery cleared, Judge Carter met my eyes one last time and offered a gentle, knowing nod. It wasn't favoritism that saved me. It was the enduring power of my father's honesty. 12 years prior, Daniel Morgan gave kindness freely to strangers on a dark, freezing mountain road without ever asking for a single thing in return. He had cast a seed of goodness into the world, and more than a decade later, when I stood alone, defenseless, and surrounded by wolves, that exact goodness returned to shield his daughter. I walked out of the courthouse and drove back to our family home. As I stepped onto the front porch, the weight that had been crushing my chest for months was finally gone. The house was safe, my father's honor was intact, and his legacy of quiet decency lived on through me. What would you have done if you found yourself standing alone in that courtroom? Have you ever witnessed a small act of kindness return to save someone years later? Comment below with the city or country you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. Thank you for watching until the very end.